What if Britain's most defining feature, being an island, is actually one of its most recent developments? Not a permanent condition, but the result of slow, almost imperceptible change. Because there was a time when you could walk from here to Europe and no one would have thought it unusual. Welcome to the making of Britain. It's easy to think of Britain as something fixed, a clearly defined shape on a map, separated from the continent by a narrow stretch of water. That separation feels natural, inevitable even, but for most of human history it didn't exist. The land we now call Britain was once part of a much larger expanse, connected directly to mainland Europe by a vast low-lying region now lost beneath the North Sea. This area, known as Doggerland, was not a marginal strip of land, but a substantial landscape of rivers, forests, and open plains. It supported human communities, animals, and ecosystems that would be familiar in many ways, yet set within a geography that no longer exists. The idea of Britain as an island would have made little sense in here. It was simply part of the land. Doggerland was not an empty space waiting to disappear. It was inhabited, used, and understood by the people who lived there. Rivers flowed across it, creating routes and boundaries. Forests provided shelter and resources. Animals migrated through it, shaping patterns of movement and survival. For early human communities, this was a landscape of opportunity. There was no clear divide between what we now think of as Britain and Europe. Movement was fluid. Trade, in its earliest forms, was not constrained by water. The idea of crossing from one distant place to another did not yet exist in the way it would later. Instead, there was continuity, a sense that this was all part of a single, connected world. The separation of Britain from Europe did not happen suddenly. There was no single moment when the land disappeared and the island emerged. Instead, it was a gradual process, driven by the end of the last ice age. As massive ice sheets melted, sea levels began to rise. At first, the changes would have been subtle. Coastlines shifted slightly. Low-lying areas became marshy, then flooded. Over generations, these changes accumulated. What had once been solid ground became increasingly unstable, increasingly fragmented. Communities would have adapted as best they could, moving to higher ground, adjusting their patterns of life. But the direction of change was constant. The land was being reclaimed by the sea. At some point, gradual change gave way to something more decisive. As sea levels continued to rise, Doggerland was reduced to a series of islands before disappearing entirely beneath the water. There is evidence to suggest that catastrophic events, such as a large underwater landslide and a resulting tsunami, may have accelerated this process. What had once been a continuous land bridge was now broken. Britain was no longer connected. The transformation was complete, even if it had taken centuries to unfold. For the people living through it, the experience would not have been one of a single dramatic moment, but of an environment that was steadily, irreversibly changing. And eventually, the possibility of simply walking to the continent was gone. What does it mean for a place to become an island? At first, perhaps not very much. People continued to live, to hunt, to adapt. Boats could be built. Short crossings could be made. The connection to Europe did not disappear entirely. It changed form. But over time, the implications deepened. Physical separation began to shape patterns of movement, communication, and interaction. Travel required more planning, more effort, more intention. The sea became both a barrier and a route. It limited some forms of contact while enabling others. Slowly, almost invisibly, geography began to influence how communities developed. how they related to others, and how they understood their place in the world. Even as an island, Britain was never isolated in an absolute sense. Trade continued, ideas moved, people crossed the water. But the nature of those connections had changed. Distance was no longer measured simply in miles, but in difficulty and risk. Crossing water required technology, skill, and favourable conditions. This altered the scale and frequency of interaction. Some contacts became more selective, more controlled. Others became more significant precisely because they required effort. Over time, this contributed to a sense that Britain was connected but distinct. Not cut off, not entirely continuous with the continent either. The sea created a kind of filter, shaping what passed between places. As societies became more complex, the fact of being an island took on a new meaning. Water could act as a form of protection. It did not make Britain immune from invasion, far from it, but it did shape how invasions occurred. Armies could not simply arrive over land. They had to cross the sea, organise transport, manage logistics in a different way. This introduced constraints, delays, and opportunities for defence. Over time, this contributed to a perception of Britain as a place that was separate, defensible, and in some sense distinct from the continent. That perception would become part of political and cultural thinking, reinforcing the idea that geography and identity were linked. The idea of Britain as an island is not just a physical reality, it's also a way of thinking. It shapes how history is told, how relationships with Europe are understood, and how difference and connection are imagined. And yet, this idea is built on a relatively recent geological change. There was nothing inevitable about it. For much of the past, the separation did not exist. Recognising this does not diminish the importance of Britain's island status. Instead, it places it in context. It shows that what feels permanent is often the result of long processes of change. It also reminds us that identity is not fixed. It's shaped by circumstances, including the physical environment, but also by how those circumstances are interpreted. Looking back, it's tempting to see the separation of Britain from Europe as the beginning of a clear distinction, a moment that set the course for everything that followed. But that would be too simple. The process was gradual, uneven, and experienced differently by those living through it. For some, the loss of land would have been immediate and disruptive. For others, the change would have been slower, almost imperceptible. What matters is not just what happened, but how it was understood at the time. There was no concept of Britain as a distinct island nation waiting to emerge. There was only communities adapting to a changing landscape, responding to pressures that they could not fully control. The submergence of Doggerland represents both loss and transformation. Land disappeared along with the ecosystems and human activities it supported. At the same time, a new geography emerged, one that would shape the future in profound ways. The formation of the island created conditions that influenced trade, defence, culture, and identity over thousands of years. It's not simply a story of progress or decline, it's a story of change, one set of possibilities giving way to another. And it invites a broader reflection on how much of what we take for granted is contingent, the result of process. So, if Britain's identity as an island was not inevitable, but the result of slow geological change, what else that feels permanent might also be temporary. What other features of the country, its resources, its landscapes, its patterns of life, are the product of deep time rather than fixed design? Thanks for walking a little further along the route that built Britain with me. If you enjoyed it, there's a button especially for that, and I'd really appreciate a click. It helps more than you can imagine. If you subscribe, there's a whole back catalogue of videos like this for you to enjoy, including this one, chosen especially for you by YouTube. Have a look. I think you'll like it. So until next time, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.